Hey everyone, and welcome to another Into the Terminal. Today we're going to be talking about file systems.
Everybody loves file systems, right?
Well, I thought the episode title was No One Cares About File Systems.
I don't know. Shantanu got in the chat. First thing they said was, "We care." So apparently we're wrong.
Well, why don't we jump into the terminal? We'll just look at a couple of file system-y things and go from there. So I know that in the past we've done stuff like covered the df command, right, which shows you your mounted file systems and a little bit of data about them. That's a great tool for when you are struggling with things like file system freeness. And then there's also a df-i, right, which shows you your inodes, and we'll talk a little bit about inodes in a bit. But these two things together, free space or data blocks that are there available, and inodes, which are file pointers being available, those are the two things that are the resources offered by your file system to store files. But then there's like some other stuff too, such as what kind of file systems are these? So Nate, what's the default file system type we use on Red Hat Enterprise Linux?
So as of what was it, RHEL 7 or 8? It's XFS.
Yeah, RHEL 7 was where it became the default. So if I use the mount command, which shows me like all the devices, and it's way too much, but I'm going to highlight this line right here. So my slash file system is a type XFS. And this is going to dictate what tools I need to use to be more, to work with it further. Let's put it that way. Right. What is another very common to see file system type on Linux, Nate?
Sorry, I was reading a chat. What was the question?
What's another very common file system type to see on Linux?
Oh, EXT. Well, various versions of EXT, but EXT4 is the most recent.
Yeah, EXT4. So way back, we start with EXT2. If you're still using EXT2, woof. But then we added journaling to it, and that is what the big difference was to get to EXT3. And EXT4 is a longer or another revision on the EXT file system. And it does some stuff like closes the gaps some between what we have in XFS and what was not present in EXT3. And we'll talk a little bit about that after the deeper, or when we transition to the deeper dive. But the big thing is you use something like a mount to figure out what kind of file system you have. You may have a mix. In fact, I'm going to create an ext4 file system on this machine to play around with during the deeper dive. But you need to know what kind of file system you have, so know what tools you can use. So the default on RHEL is XFS. So you would have had to work hard to actually not use XFS if that was your choice.
Well, not that hard.
That's the case.
You just have to make a choice at install time, really. It's not that hard.
I mean, you have to actually pay attention and not just click next.
Yeah. Right. I mean, you shouldn't just be clicking next when you're partitioning your disks anyway. But yeah, if you didn't pick EXT4, you'll have XFS.
Says you. I'm the server with GUI guy. I just click next blindly.
Never a GUI, man. Never.
So if we're interested in some of the parameters of our XFS file system, we can use XFS info on this device. And this tells us a little bit, this tells us a little bit about our XFS file system. And so it gives us some like low level detail, like what's the block size of this file system? We get some information on like where the, or how many blocks it has in total. We get some things about inode somewhere in here. Inode size is 512 bytes, or sorry, yeah, it could be K. I can't remember. So there's not a whole lot here, right? Because XFS has a whole bunch of tune stuff that goes into it when it's made. And so we don't offer a lot of tuning things to the end user for XFS because it just kind of works. And the reason that we chose XFS as the default in RHEL 7 and later is that it had some really nice things around automatically defragmenting. So just like by using the file system, it would take care of fragmentation that occurred on the system. The other really big thing is that at the time, EXT3, with how it was designed, had limits on how many directories one could create. And so you're limited to how many like subdirectories could be in a directory. And XFS, because of how it stores things, didn't have that limitation. And that's the big reason why in RHEL 7 we switched to XFS, because people like to store things, and they get really mad when they can't store things because they get some kind of error from their file system. They get even more mad when they store things or think they've stored things and they can't get it back again. So so
there's some resiliency benefits to XFS, and there's also pretty large file system size difference, if I read correctly before, as in prep for this episode, right?
Yeah. So again, I think
that only matters when it matters, right? Like most people aren't making exabyte size file systems, but if you need them,
right. And to that end, like XFS can still have the larger total addressable file system space for a single file system than EXT4. But EXT4 has fixed a lot of those kind of limits that were there with EXT3, so that they're no longer the case, right? So now you can pretty much have as many subdirectories as you want. You can pretty much have as much disk space in a file system as you want with EXT4. But with EXT3, that was not the case. EXT3 definitely had smaller overall file system limits and this like weird subdirectory limit that
if I recall, EXT3 had limits that were like in the single digit terabyte ranges. I don't remember exactly what it was. It was like 2 terabytes or something.
It was more than that, but they also changed it with EXT3 and then EXT4 even further.
4 is definitely much larger.
Like that. Yeah. So I think if we are actually looking at theoretical limits, XFS still probably has larger theoretical limits than EXT4, but practically, like that's not a thing.
Most people don't care about that size of a storage volume unless they're using some specialized file system anyway, right?
Right. So if we have a mix or you chose EXT4, the tool that you use to get this kind of information out of the extended type file systems is called tune2fs. And I formatted a file as a file system, and I'm going to pipe that to this. -L. There we go. So tune2fs is how you make tuning changes. -L will list the things that are setting in your file system. You might also be able to get this with a command called dump e2fs, but dump e2fs also dumps out a whole bunch of additional data on your block groups and inode groups and where they're stored, which most people don't care about. But with the gloriousness of scrolling, that would be what you end up seeing on the screen and not this list of parameters. So like XFS, we get things like, hey, how many inodes do I have? How many blocks do I have? This also has the idea of reserved blocks. So the extended type file systems will, by default, have a certain amount of disk space reserved for root only to write to. So in the case of a like full file system, root owned processes can still write, but if you're a regular user, you would be given a no more free disk space error. And then we get a little bit of reporting on like how much free space is left in there. Just like XFS, you get the block size. So like how big is the smallest allocatable unit of disk space, and it's 4K, which is the same default that we're using on XFS. All right, so there you go. That's kind of what the parameters are. And I told you could do just dump e2fs.
Yep.
Right, so it starts off with the same stuff, but then it goes down into this level of detail, which is here's where the super block is at, and here's the block and inode free bitmaps, and here's how many free blocks and inodes are within this block group. And I'll talk in the deeper dive a little bit about what that means and how that's organized. But yeah, so like
it's funny that some of these tools still have a 2 in them. I assume that's because they were created in the E2FS days, and then they were just carried forward as we got EXT3 and 4, or am I wrong there?
No, that is correct.
That's what I
So
thought.
the extended type file system started with EXT and then was EXT2, hence the E2 something somethings.
Right.
And then we just kind of kept bolting onto it and making changes to it. And so you still use the E2 something commands, even though you might be using an EXT3 or EXT4 formatted file system.
There was a point where the tools to make an EXT3 file system were just the EXT2 tools, and you added a command line option that says also add a journal, right?
Right. Yep.
So,
and now they've like made that automatic with some of the MKFS commands, so that there's an extension for EXT3 and an extension for EXT4, so it makes the right choices when doing those formatting.
Right. They're cleaner now than they were then. I'm just saying that we're talking a decade or more ago.
All right. So I think that kind of like gets us off in like, here's how you look at some deep data about your file system. And then after the transition, we'll do a little bit of whiteboarding, which I know everyone loves.
Everybody loves a whiteboard.
Loves. And then we'll talk about, a little bit on journaling and what that means. We'll also talk about the other file system types, and I'll give you a couple commands because I see we've already gotten a couple of good questions about EXT4 tooling. So we'll talk about a couple of those too.
All right. Well, then we'll see you after the break. Here we are after the break. So while Scott gets his whiteboard set up, I just want to call out that we have 2 other episodes where we hold on, we got infinite loop going on here. There we go. We had 2 other episodes where we talked about not specific file systems, but things like troubleshooting file systems and using file systems, and those will be noted in the notes for today's show.
All right. I think we're ready for whiteboarding. We'll see how this goes.
Here we go. No more infinite loop.
All right. So when you're looking at a file system, essentially, we talked earlier, when you look at the df and the df minus I, it shows you your 2 parameters the file systems give you, which is data blocks and inodes. So if we're looking at a file system, so here's my disk. When I create a file system, it's going to create these like areas of the disk. And inside of the area of the disk, there's going to be metadata tracking areas. And then over here, this is the data blocks. And so when we create a file and it gets an inode, that inode is actually like in here. And it tracks all the properties of this file. So if you do like an ls minus I and it gives you the inode number, that's corresponding to a tabular entry, like an actual like cell in this table inside of your disk storage. And that unique identifier is then tied to all the metadata about that file. So when you look at things like the permissions or the ownerships or access control lists, if they're applied, or the number of links or the modified timestamp, all that stuff is actually stored in this table on disk. And then the last bit of that entry for that one file is pointers to the data blocks that hold the data for that file. And so out here, those are like all the little blocks of data that make up your file. But there's a certain number of pointers that you can have in your inode entry. And so if your file is big, what ends up happening is the pointers in the inode table are pointers to data blocks, which then get converted to blocks of additional data block pointers. So maybe like this one over here is converted to a block of data block pointers. So the inode goes to these guys and that one. And then this one points to data blocks on disk. And there's a limit to how many of these that you can have. So this is what's called an indirect block, right? So the inode points to the data block that has been converted to more file system pointers. And you can go further. You could actually have this guy that's a converted block, an indirect block. And your file might be so big that it actually has to convert others to indirect blocks. Which then point at your actual data for your file. So this is what's known as a doubly indirect block or a double indirect block. So the inode pointers point to an indirect block, which then points to a double indirect block, which then points to the actual addresses of the data blocks on disk that hold the contents of your file. But wait, there's more. You can actually go even deeper and have a triple indirect block. And so your large files might have like your inode pointers point to a indirect block, which has been converted to point to a bunch of doubly indirect blocks, which have then been converted to point to triply indirect blocks. And then the triple indirect blocks are the ones that actually point to all the data. And so when you look at file systems and they say like, oh, there's a maximum file size, individual file size for this file system, that's why. Because there's a limit to how many pointers you can convert. Like you wouldn't want to do quadruply indirect blocks or I don't know, whatever 10 is, right? Decahedral indirect blocks, because what would happen is to try and reassemble that file into its composite data, you would have to bounce so far and do so many lookups that the file system performance would be super slow. So for large files, we had limits on how many indirections you could do, and that was three. Three indirections is all you could do. Now, there are other ways that you could get to handle larger files too. Like you could go to larger block sizes of your file systems. So each one of those file system pointers that's pointing to a data block would actually point to 64K of space instead of the default, which is 4K of space. So there's some tweaks like that that you can do as an administrator if you know that you're going to be storing large files that will allow you to store more file contents and therefore have fewer redirections and file pointer management, which will lead to better recovery of the data back once you're getting it back. But that also requires a little bit of advance notice. And then the other thing is if you have a 64K block size, but your actual file contents is 2K, well, the smallest amount of data you can store is 64K. And so you end up putting that 2K into a 64K sized block. So a bunch of that disk space is unusable. And so 4K has like historically been kind of the sweet spot for how we do this. All right. So Nate, questions thus far?
We've got some questions around XFS shrinking, which probably are irrelevant for the moment. So maybe we'll talk about that later on in the show. I don't think we've had much other than a reference to this feels like I'm back in college learning about file systems
with whiteboards. Yes.
And there was a lot of confusion when we called it a whiteboard and it came up black. So
it's dark mode whiteboard.
Yeah, right. I figure if you're watching into the terminal, you probably expect a dark background. So here we are.
Oh, fair enough. All right. So with the EXT type file systems, right, it's this kind of scenario where we put this like inode table and then a selection of blocks to go with it, and an inode table and a selection of blocks to go with it. But for XFS, it's a little bit different. And so let's see, can I erase all this? Not easily. What if I make it really large?
It's efficient.
Man, that's really just a waste of everyone's time to watch me erase things.
Isn't there a clear? What about that little trash can button at the bottom? Is that a trash can button?
It is, but you know, we're here now.
Too late now. We've already done it.
That's right. All right. So XFX works a little bit differently. So you've got your disk, right? Whatever size you've made it. And then XFS, what it does is it creates inodes just like before with that squiggle that you can't read. And then it starts storing your files, right? And when you've used up enough disk space or you've used up enough inodes, it'll actually just like allocate another segment. The problem is it does this on the fly. And so sometimes you may have an inode intensive workload where you're doing things like creating small files, which don't use a lot of disk space, but they use a lot of inodes. And so if that were the case, this whole thing would be full and we'd have all our files out here. But when we had to create a new segment, notice the amount of disk space in each segment is different.
Right.
Right. And this is where XFS shrinking becomes a problem because we create these like extended areas, but we do it on the fly based off of the file system usage. So it's more organically grown, which means unlike the EXT file systems where there's an inode table that's this size, there's blocks that are this size, and we know that that's just a repeated pattern throughout. So that if we want to shrink it, we would know exactly where the next boundary of inodes and data blocks are. With XFS, we don't necessarily know where that boundary is, or at least easily able to get at that boundary. And that's why you can't shrink XFS file systems. You can only grow them because if you're growing them, you're adding more disk space to the XFS file system. And as it needs to, it'll add inodes and data block addressing.
So there we go. We answered it anyway. And, you know, I got to say, that sounds like a problem that maybe could be solved, but is there a high enough demand, right? Because I can tell you the number of times I've had to shrink a file system in my administration days, I can probably count on one hand, right? Like usually it's grow. You're always growing. File systems are always getting bigger. Smaller,
and
not nearly as often.
And the place where I see the most desire for shrinking is mistakes.
Yes, mistakes is one thing. The other would be, you know, like if you're migrating data from one place to another, or we saw this when Satellite moved its content repository to a different subfolder, right? And there was like this migration process where we needed the thing to be bigger, but only during the migration. And some people were like, "Well, how do I make it smaller again?" And unfortunately, the answer was, "You can't." Right? But again, these are very specific use cases that just aren't that common.
Well, and we can go ahead and turn off the screen share and I can get back to a terminal. But the other thing is that the other place where I see people want to do shrinking is that they've allocated their file system layout. They have a more exotic file system layout. Maybe it's security standards compliance or something where it's like var log has to be a separate file system. And then they realized that they made this one too big and made that one too small. And they're trying to shift space from one to the other. And so they want to shrink one to grow the other one. And that won't work for XFS. However, I would submit that the other alternative is you slap more drives in that puppy and then just grow your XFS file systems. So either actual more drives in it, or in the case of virtualization, you just like attach more disk space to it as additional drives, or in like fiber or storage array type situation, you have them expose more LUNs to you so that you see more drives and then you just grow to that.
But hold on, then I have to talk to the storage admin. I don't want to talk to the storage admin.
I mean, I don't blame you because, you know, storage admins, not really.
Those guys.
They're fine people. Fine people. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is people are like, well, but I'm wasting all of that space and I want to be as optimal as possible.
Yeah,
and that's true.
I get it. Yeah.
But it's relatively minor to like stick some more disk space on the thing and then grow as needed.
Yeah. I don't want to minimize the request, right? Well, I understand why people would want to do it. I just think that it's less common, much less common.
All right.
Yeah. Granted, Penguin mentions that on physical servers, it's a more common problem. And that's absolutely true. I've allocated my physical disks in a certain way, and that needs to change. And yes, it's a much bigger problem because you're much more constrained.
Yeah. And so physical servers, there's also like, well, if you've maxed out your hardware rate or whatever, it's difficult to just add more disk to it. Totally get it.
Right.
All right. So, Nate, the other thing that we wanted to talk about was journaled file systems. Right?
Yes, journal file systems. I'd say most modern file systems are in fact journaled. Maybe that's too broad of a statement.
No, I think that's accurate. And we mentioned at the beginning of the show that EXT3, the big difference between EXT2 and EXT3 was EXT3 had a journal log.
Yep.
So, Nate, do you know how journaling works?
I mean, I have this basic concept that a journal is this additional sort of log, right, of what's on the disk, where it lives, things like that, that helps make the file system more resilient to interruptions and errors, right? How it works, man, I got no idea. It's magic.
Okay. So like how it works is there's actually a file called the journal log that's in your file system. It is embedded there. And in fact, if we looked at EXT4, it'll actually tell us the inode number that goes along with our journal log if we want to try and find it.
Right.
In the early days, it actually put down a file, like a file with a dot as its name. But we figured out that people would find that and mess it up. And so we just like obscure it entirely from
What's this thing taking up space on my drive? Delete that.
Delete it. Yeah. All right. So there are a couple of different ways that you can run your journal. The most common way and the default way is that your journal will include metadata about disk transactions. And so when you're going to do a file write, it really only applies to writes. When you're going to do a file write or a file create or making a new file and allocating new stuff, it'll open the journal log and put in an entry that says, oh, about to do this disk operation, this file system operation. And then it goes and does the file system operation. And then it puts in a journal log entry that says, this file operation is completed. And so if you have a power outage and the machine comes back on, it can look at the journal log and it can look for transactions that have an open transaction message where it was going to go do something, but it doesn't have a matching close transaction message, which means it didn't complete. And so oftentimes what will happen is it'll go out and like remove any partially completed bits of the file transaction. You just lose that file transaction.
Right.
But that keeps you from
losing
having
a whole disk or you lose a file, a couple files.
Yeah, and it keeps you from having like a corrupted file or like other weird things happening on your file system. So we'd rather have no data than like not data that's accurate, right? Because nobody cares about file systems until they can't get their data back, and then they really care. So if we thought that it was written out and then we come back and it's all mangled because it was only half written out and then we had a failure, that would be a place where somebody would get really mad. So that's like in metadata journaling what happens. We put it in this open transaction, we go out and we do the data write or whatever, and then we put the closed transaction message in. That's how we know it was completed successfully. If it's not completed successfully, we have some stuff to try and mitigate partially written or partially applied file changes. The other way you can run journal is in a mode we call journaled mode. And for that one, it actually like puts in the open transaction message, hey, I'm going to do this file IO for the file system. And then it actually puts in a copy of what it's going to transact. And then it goes out and does it. And then it has a closed transaction message. So when you're running in this way, if you have a power outage or something that keeps the transaction from completing, when we look in the journal log, we see the entry of the journal. We actually don't see the matching close, but we also have all the data that was going to be written. And so we could just replay that transaction and re-execute it. And we know what data is supposed to go there. So for like the extremely not fault tolerant person where they want that extra security and or the extra resiliency that provides, they can do it. The downside is now they're writing every file twice. Right? Once to the journal log, so it can be journaled, and then once to the disk, so that we can make sure that the transaction completed successfully. And so there's some stuff that you can do to try and mitigate that. Like you can actually run your journal log on a different device. So you can write your file data over here to this journal and then come to your file system and actually do the stuff. You can actually do them both at the same time so that you're not constantly waiting on the journal log to become available that's stopping your disk IO from happening. So there are some people that run it in that mode, but like it's much, much, much more IO intense. And that is not the default way that we run it.
Right. So we did have two questions, and this might be a good spot for them. First, and here I'll pop it up on the screen. So, has there been a change in how XFS can now be forced file system checked on next boot?
So, you know, let's jump into the terminal. I'll show you XFS file system check.
Okay, well, there is one other question that might not require a terminal yet, and that is, how does journaling differ in XFS versus EXT4? And I think we're going to touch on that in a little bit. I just wanted to address that there is a question.
I mean, there's really not a ton of difference. Like think about maybe some slight form, like content differences of what it's tracking in terms of metadata, but the theory of what it's writing and how it's writing is pretty much the same between them.
Okay. All right, so let's get that terminal up.
All right. So if I run FSCK.xfs on that, notice it gives me this immediate error.
Right.
Oh, hey, you wanna repair a damaged file system? Oh, you should use this XFS utility called XFS Repair. XFS Repair knows the format of the XFS file system and will try and basically does an FSCK, but with the idea that it's going to repair any weird state things. So there is no automatic FSCK for XFS.
Right.
You have to literally run this tool in order to make it repair it. And oddly, or additionally, the if actually I can try to run it. So maybe I want to XFS repair dev SDA1. All right. Nope, can't be run on a mounted file system. You got to unmount it. And so if you're trying to do this on something like your / file system, you will have to go to something like rescue mode to try and have it unmounted so you can run these tools. But yeah, like generally, in fact, I don't think I've ever run this in production on a system.
Yeah, I had my home lab uses an iSCSI volume from a little Synology NAS that I have. I think once in the history of even that setup where I've had, sometimes network issues happen or like the network gear got an auto update and rebooted, right? And I wasn't expecting it, something like that, right? I think one out of the couple of times that's happened, I actually had to run XFS repair. Generally, just remounting the file system does enough to get it back up and running, and there's no issues.
So where we can make more tunable changes is EXT type file systems. So this is an EXT4 one that I put into a file because I didn't have any disk free space around, or I should say free partitions around. And what you're looking for on this guy is the right there. So this is a change to RHEL that when I formatted this file system, it actually turned off a couple of these things that in the past would automatically be seeded with some data, and you'd have to manually go back and turn them off. Nate, you were going to say something.
I was actually, Shantanu had a follow-up question. So is there no way to auto-run that file system check? Like, is there a way to tell the system, please run it at the next boot? There might be. I don't know if we've dug into that.
I have not researched it. The other place I would
Right.
look is maybe toggling the FSCK order flag in NTFS tab. That might be a way to do it.
Okay.
So that if you are going to FSCK file systems because you've had a poor shutdown, that's the order in which they should be done. But yeah, like I don't have a definitive answer because I've not researched that question.
Okay.
All right. So it used to be when you create an ext2, 3, or 4 file system, the check interval would be set between 20 and 40. Just a random number between 20 and 40. And essentially what that would mean is, actually, I take that back. It was a number of days.
Yes.
And I don't remember what the default setting was. And
Yeah.
so what would happen is you would have this thing running for a year, and then something would happen, a data center power outage or whatever, and your machine would boot back up. And because the check interval, the file system check had not been executed within however many days, it would go ahead and do one automatically at boot time. And the other one that would trigger this is this setting right here. That's the one that's normally set between 20 and 40, which is if the file system had been mounted and unmounted this number of times.
Right.
That would also trigger an automatic FSCK the next time the system was booted. The problem is with automatic FSCKs is that they're not generally needed. So
Right.
here you are, you've just had some kind of like unexpected thing like a power outage, and now you're waiting for your system to boot, and it's stopping booting.
For what reason? Yeah. And
right.
There was a point where these were considered best practice. That's the reason they were in there as the defaults, right? And there was a point, especially in the EXT2 days, where they were probably a good idea, right? This thing should be checked every so often because it doesn't have a journal. Now that we have journals, though, not such a big deal, right? I can remember back in the days when I was running servers, you know, there were certain systems that had really large file systems that were specifically there for file storage, where you'd be like, okay, we have to do maintenance on this machine, we have to reboot it. Someone has to be there to make sure that it doesn't auto file system check at the reboot time.
Yeah, and you can actually turn these off with Tune2FS, right? So
Yeah,
it's now the default. Whoops, it's now the default. But if I tune to FS-I, that's the interval, and I set it to 0 days. That means turned off. And C, that's the maximum mount count. If you set it to 0 or -1, that'll turn it off, and that'll take care of it. So you may want to check other file systems, or I know that in RHEL 8, as an example, I think it's still set, if you're creating file systems with MKFS, it would still set a maximum mount count and interval automatically. But we've now changed it to be more sane for EXT4 file systems. All right, so Shantanu points out that he's needed to force an FSCK when parts of the file system start having weird errors.
Yep. I was typing a response to that when you noticed it.
boot the machine to rescue and just FSCK it from there.
Yeah, yeah.
Rather
but
than
I guess if that's in reference to my statement that you shouldn't need file system checks because of the journal, there's always those edge cases, right? And that's why that's why the tools still exist. That's why there is an XFS repair, because we know, or the people who wrote the file system know, sometimes you're just going to have to do a file system check, and therefore here's your tool, right? Sometimes that's going to be painful, though, like in the case of, no, you can't do that on a mounted file system. And that's kind of always been the case. You couldn't do that on EXT 2, 3, or 4 either. Well, you could force the check, but it wasn't recommended.
Use -F and it would force it. The other thing that, we used to use these tools to try and control fragmentation.
Yeah.
So what would happen is your data blocks would be stored not contiguously.
Yep.
And that would mean that things like the read ahead buffer that would automatically happen when you retrieved a block off of disk would grab a bunch of blocks that weren't associated with your file and were therefore useless to you. And so we want to
Right.
try and store files as contiguously as possible to try and take advantage of some of that automatic caching and automatic look ahead that we do when expecting that another related disk IO operation is going to be requested by the operating system. But ext4 and and XFS both automatically kind of handle that as they're doing their regular file operations. If they see that the file is now larger, and there is not contiguous disk space available in its current location to store it, it'll actually move it to another area of disk that is able to store that contiguously and then mark the old location for reuse so it can store other files in that place. So this
Right.
just like happens automatically through like file system operations now, which is why
Remember my old like MS-DOS days, having to periodically remind myself to go run a defrag, right?
right,
Because nothing did it automatically then.
right. And the other place where we used to do it is like your disk space was low and then you added disk space. So now you
Yeah.
have this giant pile of contiguous disk space, but because you were operating in this smaller, more constrained environment, it wasn't paying attention to the fragmentation. It was just like trying to store whatever it could store.
Right.
But now, if you did that, it would just kind of automatically, as you access files, will figure out that they're fragmented and it can now store it in a non-fragmented way elsewhere in the device layout.
Right.
So all this stuff just kind of works. So I see Eric asked if XFS repair feature is coming. It already exists. It's called XFS_repair. We're just
Well,
not running it. Number of
he's
things.
asking if there's an online repair coming. I haven't heard of anything.
Oh, no, you unmount it just like you do FSCK and then
Yeah.
run the repair. Let me check. There may be an option.
I mean, Linux usually gives you an option, even if it's going to make you regret life later. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's a please don't use this, but here's an option if you need it.
There's a -D repair dangerously. that sounds like
Repair dangerously.
oh,
Uh,
yeah,
that sounds
like
about right.
when
Don't
your
use this
file system,
option.
yeah, when your file system check utility is like, hey, there's this, but you probably don't want it. You probably do not want it.
Right. Right. Dangerously.
Yeah, nobody cares
I
about
like
file
to live
systems.
dangerously.
What they
I
put
always
there
put
is
on the -D.
all right. So the other file system types. So ext3. That's still pretty common, especially if you have older systems.
Yep.
ext3 is also journaled, so just like ext4, but it doesn't have the kind of auto defragging stuff that ext4 has in it, where they allocate additional extent to restore your file in a non-fragmented way.
Right.
Also, it has limits on how many subdirectories you can have in a directory and what your maximum file size is, just because of like all the redirection that one could do with data blocks there, because it was really ext2 plus, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so ext2 is another one that I see occasionally when somebody wants something really small. In fact, I tried to format something as an ext4, a very small, like 100 meg file system. Actually, maybe it's more like 2 meg file system. And I was like, nope, not enough space. Can't format as an
Yeah.
ext4.
Yeah.
But you could format that as an ext2.
I've
And
seen, and I don't know if there's a real good reason for this, but I've seen in cases like micro systems like the Raspberry Pi, for example. Raspbian, I think, was for a while defaulting to ext3 instead of 4. I don't know if there was a reason because they're using SD cards instead of spinning disks or whatever, but the file size, or not the file size, the file system size thing is really the big thing I've seen ext2 used for occasionally, because it has a smaller footprint for the file system than a journaled file system does.
Yeah, because we got to store the journal log. The other thing is like, how big do we make those inode and data block
Right.
chunks? That is bigger for ext4, and so that's why errors on those really small devices.
Right.
The other one that we get questioned about a lot is NTFS.
Yeah. Yeah, there's cases where people need to be able to share, like say a USB stick, for example, or even a disk on a dual booting system. Like say this is your desktop and you're dual booting Windows and Linux. A file system that could be read by both, and the EXT and XFS file systems ain't it because Windows doesn't support those. Well, maybe it does now in the advent of the Windows
Resell.
subsystem for Linux stuff. But for a long time, that was not the case. Sorry, no EXT file systems for you.
Yeah, and where I see it is like, people want to use some of the extended attributes for Active Directory as an example. And you
Right.
can't do that on the ext file systems. So Red Hat doesn't ship a NTFS driver for RHEL, but you can get it from one of the extended repositories. I want to say it's an RPM Fusion, but it's been a while since I've looked.
Yeah, I can't recall where I got it the last time I needed it.
Yeah, but so you have to use one of the add-on community repositories in order to find it.
Right.
Um,
I found VFAT to be probably a more interoperable and supported out of the box file system, but it doesn't have those extensions that NTFS does. But it'll be read by both Windows and Linux, and it has decent file system and file size limits as opposed to the older FAT file systems.
Which you could also just front it with a CIF surface. So if
Hmm.
you make the ext4 file system and then stick CIFs in front of it, Windows can then use the CIFs protocol to retrieve and store files. And that way you're storing it on ext4, but your Windows client has access to it, but you'll need like networking and other stuff to make that work.
Right, right. But in the case of like a removable disk, for example, where you hit where you're going to plug it directly into a system and you don't have that luxury, then something like VFAT works pretty well.
Yeah. Shantanu references the NTFS is actually an Apple. So go
There you
us.
go. I couldn't remember if it was Apple or Fusion, so thank you.
Yeah. Nate, I know that we wanted to mention ZFS.
There was a question about it earlier,
Yeah.
which
Did
was
you
answered
answer?
in chat. It was basically, why don't you support ZFS? So if that's where you're headed, there you go. There's your lead
Yeah.
up.
So licensing is why we don't
Yeah.
ship ZFS. Um, the ZFS file system is under a source available but not GPL compatible license. And Red Hat only ships GPL compatible software in RHEL. There's more openness with Fedora community. They'll do BSD and some other types of licenses, but in RHEL is GPL version 2 compatible licenses.
Right.
And then the other one that we didn't talk about that's probably notable is btrfs or btrfs.
Yep.
So what do you know about btrfs, Nate?
I know that it was explored as an option in RHEL. What was that, in the RHEL 7 or 8 days? I forget when it was. It came in as tech preview and then went away. And it's still available in the Fedora world. A lot of Fedora spins, even you still use that as the default. Um, but yeah, it
I,
was removed from RHEL.
yeah, I think Fedora uses it as the default.
Yeah, I believe
The,
Fedora proper uses it as the default. Some of the spins do, but some don't. It depends on who made the spin,
yeah. And
what they like.
so the reason that we don't include btrfs in RHEL is that we have to support stuff in RHEL for really, 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 really long times,
Right.
which means we have to have a bunch of developers that we can keep on staff to help maintain and manage that thing over time. And I don't think we have the depth for btrfs at this point to commit to maintaining it. But btrfs is actually kind of cool because it actually started way, way back, or a lot of the concepts that it uses way, way back with RiserFS.
Hmm.
Um, So RHEL was recently removed from the kernel because it was no longer maintained. But the idea was, instead of this like inode and data block relationship that we use in much of our traditional file systems, with RHEL it used a hashing algorithm to try and guess the data block on which your file started. And there were a whole bunch of offsets if that one wasn't available that were programmatically put into the algorithm. And so you could like do away with inodes and indirection entirely by using this hashing algorithm. And btrfs is using a binary tree algorithm, BTR, binary tree. And so it does something similar where like every step along the binary tree, you have all of the potential paths to get back to your file. And so binary tree is like a really well-known algorithm throughout computing because it is one of the fastest ways to search for a thing. And so btrfs uses binary tree algorithm to try and get your file contents back. And it does away with things like the traditional inode and inode redirection that we use in XFS and EXT file systems.
So somebody mentioned Stratus in the comments as something opposed to btrfs. I don't have a feature list that I can compare Stratus to btrfs, but yes, Stratus is included in RHEL. We did not think to include it in today's episode, though. We did talk about that, didn't we? Maybe we'll have another episode where we talk about
because Stratus isn't a file system thing, Stratus is a device management thing. And so btrfs has some integrated features like deduplication of data blocks. It also has storage pooling. And so Stratus is how we can implement storage pooling. And it has deduplication and copy on write capability in addition to the file system that's managed on the Stratus device. So instead of btrfs, which does it all kind of in the same thing, same technology, with Stratus is the one responsible for pooling your storage, kind of like LVM. And then Stratus is what's going to do the deduplication and copy on write management. The file system still does the normal file system, inode, data block stuff. So the Stratus device is what's actually doing a lot of these features that are integrated into btrfs for optimization.
Right.
So, and I've heard people have said, LVM, Stratus, and XFS has the same feature set as something like the commonly used features in ZFS and btrfs. So if you combine those technologies together, you'll get a similar capability stack.
All right, well, we're almost at an hour. We should probably wrap it up. What do you think?
We should. So what are we doing next week, Nate?
Next week, we talked about we were going to do LVM. Maybe should we put some Stratus in there too, maybe?
We'll see.
We'll decide later.
It's getting awfully close to Summit. Time is at a premium right now.
That is true. Let's see. Like I said, we've got those 2 other episodes about file systems and file system troubleshooting. We'll make sure those are linked in the description, so you can go check those out if you're interested in more file system information.
Yeah, and I think those are at least one of those is in the troubleshooting supercut. So if you guys hadn't seen it, we posted a video on the YouTube channel as a recorded video. That was actually an amalgamation of a whole bunch of troubleshooting episodes that we did. And the file system troubleshooting episode was a component of that. But it's like a 4-hour video of all the troubleshootings.
Yeah. But people are loving it. We've had a lot of people view it. A lot of people comment to us that they enjoy it. So, I guess if you have trouble sleeping at night, want to hear us talk about troubleshooting Linux, go pop that on.
All right. So until next time, great to see everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.
Yep. Everybody have a great one.